No maps, no backup, no second chances. Out there in the wild frontiers of early America, survival didn't come easy. It had to be earned. Every sunrise was uncertain, and every nightfall a gamble. There were no lifelines, no calls for help. The only thing a man could rely on were his instincts and his tools. The rules of the wilderness were brutal. Nature didn't care about your background, your name, or your strength. It only cared if you could adapt. Because if you couldn't, you didn't make it out. Now imagine standing on the edge of the untamed frontier, your back to civilization, your future wrapped in mist and danger. Every step forward is into the unknown. The forests stretch for miles. The rivers twist like serpents. Storms howl. Predators wait. And you're carrying only what you can hold. In that moment, every tool becomes more than gear. It becomes your lifeline. There were no extra chances. No mistakes allowed. One wrong move, and you'd be frozen in a ravine, starved beside an empty fire pit, or bleeding in silence from a cut turned deadly. The men who survived weren't lucky. They were prepared. They carried 7 things. 7 essential tools, each with a purpose, with a story of blood, sweat, and hard-earned wisdom passed from man to man. These weren't fancy inventions. They were brutally efficient, forged in the fires of necessity. Let's dive into the truth of what kept these men alive, because without these tools, the American frontier would have swallowed them whole. Out in the wild, there were no second chances. Every sound in the trees could be a predator. Every movement in the underbrush could be a rival, or worse, hunger itself stalking you. For the frontiersman, survival wasn't about brute strength. It was about preparation, and the one object he never let out of reach. The one thing that could spell the difference between returning home with a full pack or never returning at all was the Flintlock rifle. This weapon was more than a tool. It was his lifeline, his companion, his protector. It represented autonomy, the ability to hunt for food instead of starve, to defend against threats instead of retreat, to face down the wilderness and win. The rifle didn't guarantee survival, but without it, you had almost no chance at all. Imagine standing knee-deep in snow with nothing but the clothes on your back and the cold biting at your skin. Game is scarce. The wind is howling. You spot movement, a distant deer, barely visible through the tree line. Your stomach aches from 2 days of emptiness. In that moment, your entire survival hinges on one steady shot. One flick of the trigger, one flint strike, one clean fire, and if you miss, it might be another 2 days before you even see life again. That's what the Flintlock rifle represented, a razor-thin edge between feast and famine. But this wasn't a modern firearm. It didn't fire in bursts. It didn't reload in seconds. It took skill, patience, precision. Powder had to be draw-hemped and loaded carefully. The flint had to spark. The pan had to catch. And once you fired, you were vulnerable. A reload could take 30 seconds. More than enough time to become prey yourself. So every shot was a decision. Every trigger pull was a gamble. And yet, it remained the frontiersman's most trusted asset. It wasn't just about food either. The wild was full of things that walked on 2 legs. Things with eyes with hearts like yours, but no mercy. Bandits, outlaws, deserters, and sometimes fierce territorial conflicts that turned fatal in seconds. In those moments, a rifle wasn't about sport. It was about staying alive. The sound of a flintlock firing into the night could silence a camp of whispering threats. It sent a messaging: this man is not unarmed. This man will fight back. And that message was often the only thing standing between you and ambush. The rifle was also ritual, maintained daily, oiled carefully, cleaned with reverence. A frontiersman might go days without speaking to another soul, but he'd talk to his rifle, whisper to it, thank it after a successful hunt, curse it when it misfired. It wasn't just wood and iron. It was an extension of his will, his purpose, his grit. He might lose his horse. His pack might fall into a river. His boots might wear through, and his map might blow away in a storm. But if he had his rifle, he still had a chance. The rifle told stories. Every dent on the stock, every scratch along the barrel was a memory of a long hunt, a narrow escape, a life taken so a life could continue. He didn't carry it for glory. He carried it because it worked. Because the frontier didn't give you choices. It gave you situations. And in most of them, a rifle was the only answer. At night, when the fire cracked and the cold crept in, a man might sleep with his rifle within arm's reach, loaded and ready. Not out of fear, but out of instinct. Because the man who slept too soundly, who forgot to prepare, who thought, just one night unarmed, was safe. That was the man they found frozen, clawed, or worse, never found at all. Young boys learned early. Their first rifle wasn't just a gift. It was a rite of passage. It meant they could contribute, protect, be counted on, and fathers would pass their rifles down, not just for practical use, but as legacy. This rifle fed our family, they'd say. This rifle saw more winters than you. Take care of it, and it will take care of you. To the outside world, it might have looked crude, slow, outdated, but in the wild, In the thick of forest, in the depths of winter, or when danger crouched in the dark, nothing was more modern, nothing more reliable, nothing more vital. You could have all the survival skills in the world, but without a way to feed yourself, to defend yourself, to make your presence known. The wilderness would swallow you whole, and that's why the Flintlock rifle was never optional. It was the one tool a man never questioned, the one item he would never leave behind, because out there, where no backup was coming, where no roads led to help and no second chances existed, one thing stood between you and death. And it sat, always loaded, always ready, in the hands of a man who knew what it was worth. When night fell on the frontier, it didn't ease in gently. It crashed like a wave. The wind grew colder, the silence deeper, and the darkness came alive. It wasn't like the cities or towns. There were no lanterns on street corners, no cabins with warm hearths glowing in the distance. There was just you, the wilderness, and the creeping chill that crawled through every crack in your clothing, whispering promises of frostbite and fatigue. In that void, fire wasn't comfort. It was salvation. A fire starter kit didn't look like much. A piece of flint, a striker, maybe some char cloth tucked to a tin. But it held power. Power to create warmth, to cook, to signal, to push back the dark. And most of all, to survive. Men didn't worship gods in the wilderness the way they did in churches. They worshipped flame. They knelt before it. They spoke to it. Because they knew without it, they wouldn't last the night. Starting a fire wasn't always a guaranteed thing. It wasn't as simple as striking a match. Especially when the air was damp, or your hands were shaking from cold, or your body was already weak from hunger. You had to know what wood burned slow, what bark caught quickly, and how to coax a single spark into a living flame. That took patience, practice, and the will to keep trying even when your fingers were numb and the wind was laughing in your face. Fire was more than heat. It was a psychological anchor. After hours of trekking through snow-covered woods or hauling pelts across frozen rivers, when muscles were sore and bones ached from the cold, the sight of fire gave something back to a man. It gave him a reason to breathe a little deeper, to believe he could make it to morning. It reminded him he was still alive. But the real value of fire showed itself in all the quiet, deadly ways the wilderness tried to kill. Boiling water meant protection from parasites that could rot your insides. Heat dried your clothes before they froze to your body. Smoke kept biting insects at bay and masked your scent from predators. Flames signaled your position if you were lost, or warned off anyone who thought you might be easy prey. And then there was cooking. Without fire, food was just flesh, dangerous, raw, crawling with sickness. With fire, it became strength, energy, life. A man could chew on bark if he had to, eat it just to fill the gnawing emptiness in his belly. But to catch a rabbit, skin it, roast it over flame. That was how he reminded his body that it could keep going. That he wasn't just surviving, he was enduring. But it wasn't just about tools. A fire starter kit meant nothing without the knowledge to use it. The man who threw sparks without care wasted precious time. The one who didn't protect his tinder from rain, or who waited too long to start a fire after sundown. He risked more than discomfort. He risked death. That's why seasoned frontiersmen guarded their fire kits like gold. A lost striker or damp flint wasn't an inconvenience. It was a sentence. They carried dry moss, pine resin, and curled birch bark in pouches inside their coats, close to the skin where body heat could keep them ready. They packed their charcloth in oilskin, tucked deep into layers where no rain or snow could reach it. Some even pre-built fire structures before dark, just in case, because one small flame could be the difference between life and a slow, silent ending. Even animals knew better than to challenge fire. Coyotes circled it but never entered its glow. Bears sniffed the air but stayed just beyond the reach of its crackle. Fire drew a boundary between man and wilderness, and as long as the flames danced, the world felt a little less hostile. You could hear it in the silence between men on long hunting trips. How the only time their shoulders relaxed was when firelight flickered on their faces. Stories flowed more easily in its warmth. So did memories. Ghosts of lost friends, frozen camps, hunts that went wrong. The fire wasn't just heat, it was connection. It reminded men they were still human in a place that tried daily to turn them into beasts. And when the fire burned low, when the embers turned red and the last logs cracked, a man knew it was time to guard it. He'd bank the coals under ashes, tuck them in tight, sometimes even carry live coals wrapped in moss from one camp to the next, because lighting a new fire from nothing was always a risk. He'd learned the hard way that one fire could take him hours, even days if the conditions turned against him. And out here, time wasn't just money. It was blood. So when a frontiersman looked down at the small tin that held his flint and striker, he didn't see scraps of metal. He saw morning. He saw a hot meal. He saw the chance to fight another day. And that meant everything. Because without fire, even the toughest man was just another body waiting to freeze in the woods. But with it, He could carve his name into the wild and walk out the other side. Rifle might win you a battle. Fire might keep you alive through the night. But neither could do what the knife could. Over and over, in 100 small ways that meant the difference between barely surviving and truly enduring. For the frontiersman, a knife wasn't just a blade. It was an extension of his will, his hands, his mind. It was a silent companion that never left his side. Not when he slept, not when he rode, and certainly not when death was close. It began its work early, at sunrise in the cold blue mist of morning, when a man needed to carve shavings from dry wood for kindling. A good knife bit through bark like a hungry animal. Later, it would skin the rabbit caught in the trap line, cut through sinew with practiced ease, slice meat into strips for drying. That same edge might pierce hide to stitch up a torn boot, or shave splinters from a split log when building a temporary lean-to. The blade never rested. There was always work. A hunting knife was no decoration. It wasn't polished or pretty. It bore scars. The handle, worn from years of sweat and blood. The steel nicked from bones and brush. But it was trusted, and in a world where trust was earned, not given, that meant everything. A frontiersman didn't need it to look good. He needed it to work every time, in every way. Whether he was gutting a deer, shaping a snare, or defending himself in a sudden attack, that knife had to be ready. It was a quiet kind of power, not as loud as a gunshot, not as bright as a fire, but it was always there. When your rifle misfired or your fire starter failed, the knife kept working. It didn't need powder. It didn't need flint. Just a steady hand, a sharp edge, and the will to push forward. There were days it saved your life, and not in ways anyone would write about in books. Not heroic moments. Just small victories. Cutting the rotten leather from a boot before frostbite set in. Trimming away the infected edge of a wound so the rot didn't spread. Carving a peg to fix a broken pack strap. Whittling time away as you waited out a storm. Shaping a spoon or a whistle or nothing at all. Just something to keep your hands moving while your thoughts stayed sane. When danger crept in close. When another man stepped out from behind a tree with a dead look in his eyes, and your powder was damp or your rifle was just out of reach. That's when the knife became something else entirely. It was no longer a tool. It was a promise that if the wild wanted to take you, it would blide for the trouble. A good knife sat in the same sheath for years, growing more valuable with every mile. The sheath itself would be patched, stitched again and again. The blade was sharpened on stones pulled from riverbeds, whetstones passed down through families. A dull knife was a death sentence. Every night after a long day on foot, a man would sit by the fire, legs sore, eyes heavy, and draw the blade across the stone. Back and forth, slow, focused. It was a ritual, not for vanity, but for survival. Tomorrow that knife might have to open a wound, or close one. Sometimes it carved into the land itself. It marked trees to signal direction. It etched initials into bark to say, "I was here. I made it." For some, it carved gravestones, simple crosses in wood. For a partner who didn't make it, a brother lost in a river crossing, a stranger buried with dignity and the last rites of steel. Men didn't often trade knives. They passed them down. Father to son, brother to brother. And when they did trade, it was always eye to eye, silent, slow, respectful. Because the blade carried more than function. It carried stories. It carried sweat, fights, meals, victories, and regrets. The knife taught discipline. If you lost it, you'd suffer. If you broke it, you'd remember why. If you neglected it, it would let you down. But if you respected it, it never failed. That kind of bond was rare in the wilderness, but it was real. And in the coldest, loneliest moments, when a man crouched beneath a pine tree in the middle of a blizzard, when the snow fell hard and the wind howled, when nothing moved and hope felt like it had frozen in his lungs, the knife was still there, pressed against his hip, heavy with purpose. Waiting, just like him. It was a constant, a symbol, a tool not of destruction, but of survival. It could build, cut, mend, fight, and sometimes it could comfort. Just the weight of it, the familiar grip, reminded a man, you're not helpless, not ever. It didn't look like much, just a dented tin cup, blackened from soot, its handle warped from too many fires. Beside it, a battered iron pot, scratched, scorched, and heavy. But out there in the wilderness, where meals were scarce and the line between life and death was often measured in ounces of energy, these weren't just pieces of gear. They were lifelines. They were survival vessels. They were quiet, unsung heroes in a brutal, unforgiving land. A man could go days without seeing another soul. He could travel from sunup to sundown, knees aching, shoulders raw from a pack that never seemed to lighten. And when the day was done, when the cold pressed in and the animals stirred in the dark, there was no better comfort than the hiss of boiling water, the smell of game meat in the pot, the steam rising like a whisper that said, "You made it through another day." The cup came out first, always, pulled from a side loop of his pack, ready at a moment's notice. With it, he scooped water from creeks, melted snow caught rain. Water was everywhere, and yet undrinkable unless it was made safe. One bad sip could wreck a man. Diarrhea, fever, parasites. The kind of sickness that made you weak, dizzy, confused. And weakness out there was more dangerous than any bear. So the fire was built, the pot filled, the cup waiting. The boil wasn't just habit. It was ritual. It was science passed down through blood and fire. A rolling boil meant safety, meant strength, meant one more day with a clear mind and a strong body. And when that cup was lifted to cracked lips, it wasn't just water, it was clarity, a drink earned by the day's struggle. Sometimes that same cup held more than water. Pine needle tea to calm the nerves and fight scurvy, bark broth in desperate times, or just strong black coffee, boiled thick and bitter to shake the sleep from a man's bones on freezing mornings. He'd sit by the fire, cradling the tin in both hands, staring into the woods, his breath fogging the air while the cup warmed his fingertips and kept the cold from setting in too deep. But the pot was where the real magic happened. If he was lucky enough to have caught something, a squirrel, a rabbit, a trout, he'd clean it with his knife, rinse it in cold creek water, and set it gently into the bubbling center of the pot. There, the wild thing became food, muscle became strength, fat became fuel. He'd add herbs if he had them, maybe wild onions, a root or two. Even pine cones were boiled for flavor and resin if the hunger got desperate enough. The soup it produced wasn't elegant, but it was everything. Hot, filling, and life-sustaining. It warmed the belly in ways fire never could. It quieted the panic that came when hunger turned sharp. There were nights when the pot held nothing but boiled hide. Leather strips from old boots, or flour and water, stirred into a tasteless paste and burned at the edges. But still, the act of boiling, of eating, even the bare minimum, gave the illusion of control, of routine. And sometimes, that illusion was all a man needed to push through the darkest hours. In group camps, the pot was communal, passed around, shared with nods, no words needed. It represented trust, unity. Even among men hardened by solitude, that circle around the kapak was sacred. Everyone had a story about a man who took more than his share, and didn't last long afterward. The frontier was harsh, but it had its code. And at the center of that code, more often than not, was a pot bubbling quietly over an open flame. During storms, the cup and pot became anchors. When wind howled and the trees bent like they might snap, when rain fell sideways and fires sputtered in protest, a man could still crouch beneath a rock ledge, huddled with his kit, boiling rainwater, holding his cup like a sacred relic. It kept the fear at bay. It kept him grounded. And when morning broke, cold, gray, and unforgiving, he'd tap the ashes, pour what he'd saved into his tin cup, and sip, slowly, quietly. It wasn't just about hydration. It was ceremony, proof that he had made it through another storm, another night. No one carved names into cups. No one painted pots or polished them. They were black, burned, and beaten, but they were loved. When a man lost his pot to a river crossing or had his cup crushed under a horse's hoof, he mourned. He felt it, because he knew. Without them, he was starting over. And out here, starting over could mean starving, or worse. So every time he packed his gear, checked his rifle, sharpened his blade, he looked for that dull metal gleam. The cup. The pot. Not shiny but solid. Not beautiful but trusted. Because in a world where even the sun couldn't be counted on, they were two of the few things that had never let him down. They didn't move. They didn't breathe. They made no sound. But the steel traps a frontiersman carried were alive in their own way. Silent hunters that waited in the dark, jaws open like teeth carved from iron, promising survival while the man who set them slept. There were days when the rifle stayed slung across his back untouched. Ammunition was too precious to waste, too slow to reload when time was scarce. And even with skill, game wasn't always visible. The forest could go quiet for hours, days even, offering no prey, no movement, just rustling wind and distant echoes. But the traps never stopped working. They waited, always ready. A man didn't just throw a trap down and hope. He studied. He learned where animals moved, watched the tiny claw marks in the mud, the patterns in the underbrush, the grooves in snow. He read the wilderness like a book written in blood and instinct. And then he set the trap, precise, deliberate, baited just right. Then he walked away. That's what made it special. While he was off chopping wood, building shelter, tending wounds, or just trying to sleep, the trap stayed behind, patient and deadly. It was an extension of him. His eyes, his hands, his hunger stretched out over distance and time. The clink of metal snapping shut was rarely heard by human ears, but it marked a small miracle in the vast loneliness of the frontier. Maybe it caught a squirrel, maybe a muskrat, maybe a fox. Not much by the standards of plenty, but out there where a man might eat nothing for 2 days, where his ribs pressed against his shirt, where even a few bites could bring back his strength, that catch was gold. It wasn't just meat. That was the obvious reward. It was fur to keep him warm. It was sinew to make cordage. It was fat for oil, for light for burning. Every part of the animal had a purpose, and the trap had delivered it silently, efficiently, and with no waste of powder, no noise to give away his position. Sometimes, he'd return to his trapline with frost stiffening his beard, his fingers barely moving from the cold, stomach aching, hope almost gone. And there it would be. A catch. Small, still, and silent. It meant he could eat. It meant he could carry on. And more than anything, it meant he hadn't failed. Traps taught patience. A man couldn't rush the woods. He couldn't demand results. He had to wait. To believe that what he set would eventually yield something. He had to walk miles through terrain that fought him every step of the way. Over logs, through rivers, across snow-covered ridges, just to check them, and sometimes they came up empty, triggered by wind, robbed by clever animals, or worse, holding nothing but blood and fur, the rest taken by scavengers. But still, he reset them. Always. Because he knew something the wild had taught him over and over: movement drains energy, but patience feeds it. Traps were time multipliers. They allowed him to do more than one thing at once. While the trap hunted, he prepared. While the trap hunted, he healed. While the trap hunted, he planned. The man who set no traps worked harder than he had to, and the frontier punished wasted energy with death. Each trap was precious. Some men only carried 2 or 3. The steel was heavy. They took up space. But no frontiersman would trade one unless he absolutely had to. In trade posts, traps were as valuable as bullets. Sometimes more, because bullets could miss. A trap never did. When it failed, it was because the man set it wrong, not because the tool didn't do its job. A trap could also be protection, not just from hunger, but from threat. In hostile areas, a man might set one behind his camp, hidden among roots or near a trail, just in case he wasn't the only one passing through. No one talked about it, but every man knew it. Traps weren't just for animals. They were deterrents. They were warning signs. They setting this place is watched. This place is defended. Come closer at your own risk. The sound of a trap snapping shut didn't echo, but in a man's mind it sang. It sang of time bought, of breath earned, of one more night survived. It meant tomorrow would come be still hungry, maybe still cold, but not empty-handed. It's easy to overlook them now. Small, rusted remnants of a past most people can't understand. But back then, in the thick of the American wilderness, traps were sacred. They were steel promises that even when a man was tired, when he had nothing left to give, something was still working for him. Something was still fighting on his behalf. The frontier could turn cruel in an instant. One moment the sun might be warming your shoulders, and the next a cold snap could sweep in and drop the temperature to deadly levels. Snowstorms, biting wind, or even just a night without fire. These could all be death sentences for the unprepared. That's why clothing wasn't just about comfort. It was about survival. Frontiersmen knew this truth intimately. They didn't wear clothes for style or show. Every layer, every seam had a reason. Every item of clothing was carefully selected, often hand-crafted or adapted to the brutal realities of wilderness life. Proper clothing didn't just keep them warm. It kept them alive. Wool was gold in the wild. Unlike cotton, which would freeze and sap the body's warmth when wet, wool retained heat even when soaked. A wool shirt, a heavy wool cloak, or underlayers made from thick sheepskin weren't luxuries. They were lifelines. These men lived in environments where hypothermia could creep in during a simple river crossing or a sudden drop in weather. They understood that when your core temperature dropped, decision-making slowed, limbs went numb, and death could follow in minutes. Their answer was insulation, not just any insulation, but materials that stood up against wind, rain, and freezing sleet. Layering was more than a comfort strategy. It was tactical. Base layers for wicking sweat, middle layers for insulation, outer layers for protection against the elements. Deer hide and buffalo robes, with their natural oils and thickness, were often used for cloaks and outer coverings. They could repel water, break wind, and insulate body heat better than any manufactured coat could. Frontiersmen often spent time tanning and curing hides themselves, knowing exactly how to treat them to preserve warmth without sacrificing mobility. Mobility, another crucial element. Survival gear didn't work if you couldn't move freely. A thick coat that restricted your arms during a fight or a heavy cloak that caught on branches in a chase could be the difference between life and death. That's why most frontiersmen wore shorter hunting jackets or fur-lined vests for core warmth, combined with flexible trousers and leggings made of buckskin. These allowed for fast movement through brush, over rocks, and during rapid escapes or ambushes. Clothing was designed to work with the man's instincts, not against them. Footwear held its own unique weight in this survival equation. A man could wrap his torso in furs and hide, but if his feet were wet and frozen, he'd still be a goner. Frontiersmen typically wore moccasins, sometimes double-layered, lined with fur or wool. Unlike stiff boots, moccasins allowed for silent movement, critical for stalking prey or avoiding hostile attention. But moccasins needed constant repair. That's why most men carried spare pairs, or patch materials, knowing a torn sole in the middle of rocky terrain could cripple progress. In colder months, men would wrap their feet in rabbit fur or use dry grasses inside their shoes as primitive insulation. A clever adaptation, borrowed from native wisdom. Headgear and gloves weren't optional. Heat escaped quickly from exposed heads and hands. Coonskin caps, thick woolen hats, or fur-lined hoods helped seal in warmth. Mittens, often made from deer hide and lined with fur, kept the fingers from going numb. Dexterity was survival. Loading a musket, setting a trap, stitching a wound. If your fingers didn't work, you didn't either. But clothing did more than just provide warmth. It served as armor. Thick buckskin pants and jackets could protect against thorny underbrush, snake bites, or even glancing knife wounds. It was common practice to stitch in extra leather patches on vulnerable areas like knees and elbows, places that took the brunt of falls or scrapes. Some men even sewed hidden pockets into their coats, storing small tools, gunpowder, or medicinal herbs. Essentials they couldn't afford to misplace. Waterproofing was a game changer. Frontiersmen often greased their garments with bear fat, beeswax, or rendered tallow to make them water-resistant. A soaked coat in freezing weather became a trap, weighing a man down and accelerating the chill. But a waxed cloak could shield him from icy rain and keep the wind from cutting through. Even the act of preparing one's gear for such protection became part of a survival ritual. Each layer sealed, stitched, and inspected with care before venturing into the wild. And then there was camouflage, not the digital camo we think of today, but natural blending. Earth tones ruled their wardrobes. Brown, grays, and muted greens helped them melt into forest or mountain terrain. These weren't just aesthetic choices. They were necessary for hunting and evading. Bright colors were an invitation to be seen. A frontiersman who wanted to live longer avoided them unless signaling or tracking with others. Clothing was also deeply personal. Men mended their garments themselves. A stitched-up tear told a story. Maybe a narrow escape from a bear or a brush with a rival's knife. Each repair added character, but more importantly extended life. These weren't disposable items. A single jacket might see a man through 5 brutal winters, becoming a second skin that bore the scars of his trials and victories. In bitter cold, even the air seemed to conspire against survival. Frostbite, windburn, and trench foot weren't rare afflictions. They were daily threats. So men learned to read the wind. They knew when to hunker down, when to dry their socks near a fire, when to tighten their leggings or add a layer. Clothing in this context wasn't passive protection. It was dynamic survival. And men who didn't understand its importance paid dearly. They shivered, they slowed, and sometimes they never got up again. Ultimately, proper clothing was more than just fabric and fur. It was knowledge, honed through trial, error, and the harshest instructor of all, the wilderness itself. A man's shirt might come the back of a deer he killed. His cloak might be sewn from the hide of a buffalo he wrestled to the ground. His boots, his gloves, his vest, all were trophies of his adaptability. The best-dressed frontiersman wasn't the flashiest. He was the warmest, the fastest, and the one who walked away alive. In the boundless wilderness where the horizon seemed to stretch endlessly and danger lurked behind every tree or rock, frontiersmen had to rely on their instincts and experience. But instincts alone weren't enough. When the sun dipped below the treetops and darkness wrapped the land in silence, there was a different kind of threat, one that crept in with the night. The ability to create and maintain fire wasn't a luxury. It was a lifeline. Without fire, a man could freeze to death even with furs on his back. Without it, the shadows would crawl closer, and wild predators with sharp teeth and silent steps could sneak into camp unchallenged. Fire was the thin barrier between life and death, warmth and cold, visibility and blindness. But the fire itself didn't start by magic. Matches were rare and unreliable. The flint and steel kit was a staple in every seasoned frontiersman's pouch. It wasn't just about striking sparks. It was about knowing how to catch them, how to coax them to life with dry tinder and patience, damp moss, shredded bark, or the inside of a kettle. These could mean the difference between a roaring campfire or a shivering night curled up in darkness. A man had to know the rhythm of fire. How much oxygen to feed it, when to let it breathe, when to shield it from the wind. During a storm, when the rain came down in cold sheets, a man could be soaked to the bone in minutes. If he didn't have dry tinder stashed in a waterproof pouch, often wrapped in animal skin or waxed cloth, he could be in real trouble. Hypothermia wasn't a myth. It came silently, numbing the fingers first, slowing the mind, draining strength until even lighting a fire was impossible. In those moments, fire wasn't just a tool, it was the will to live made visible. Beyond warmth, fire brought light. The kind of light that cut through the pressing blackness of the frontier night. That light told predators to stay back and gave comfort to a man alone or a group huddled for safety. It turned the unknown into something slightly more bearable. And when eyes reflected from the trees, fire was a warning that the camp was not easy prey. It was also a cook's hearth. Meat from a successful hunt needed proper cooking, not just for taste but survival. Undercooked or rotting food could kill as easily as any wildcat or ambusher. Boiling water over fire made streams and ponds safer to drink from, and fire could preserve meat through smoking, stretching a single kill into meals for days, sometimes even weeks. Without this ability, frontiersmen would be forced to consume their catch immediately, leaving them at the mercy of the next successful hunt or forage. Even more than its utility, fire had psychological power. When a man sat by a fire after a long, punishing day, his muscles aching, feet blistered, the memory of close calls still echoing in his mind, that crackling flame reminded him he was still alive. It was a morale booster, a moment of control in an environment that offered so little of it. It was comfort, memory, reflection. Many frontiersmen believed fire had a kind of spirit, a symbol of resilience in the face of nature's wrath. Keeping fire burning overnight was a learned art. Too much wood and the flames could catch surrounding brush. Too little and the fire would die, leaving the camp vulnerable. Some would bury hot embers beneath the soil before sleeping, insulating them so that in the morning, with just a breath and some dry grass, a new flame could be born. It saved time and energy, two things always in short supply on the frontier. Carrying fire from place to place was another technique. Hollowed-out logs or metal lanterns with coal or embers carefully wrapped in green leaves kept the flame alive during travel. Regnating a fire without fresh tools or fuel was often too risky, especially in unfamiliar territory. Fire carriers became as vital as knives or weapons, and then there was fire's role in signaling. A column of smoke could mean many things: danger, success, or simply location. For scouts moving ahead or groups traveling in staggered formations, a smoky fire gave a reference point in vast woods or endless plains. A controlled burn could also deter wild animals or drive prey into traps, used tactically by those who truly understood how to bend nature's forces to their advantage. But all this came with responsibility. Fire was a friend, but also a threat. One loose spark could ignite a forest, turn an entire valley into a death trap. So every frontiersman learned not just how to start fire, but how to respect it. Fire demanded attention. Constant, deliberate, careful. It was both a creator and destroyer. In the wrong hands, it was chaos. In skilled hands, it was salvation. So when you picture the classic image of a lone figure sitting under the stars, wrapped in a fur blanket with a fire flickering before him, know that scene is not just romantic nostalgia, it is survival made visible. That flame represents everything: skill, willpower, caution, adaptation, and the ancient instinct to keep going, no matter what. Fire was never just warmth. It was life, courage, and the fierce determination to make it through one more night. In the unforgiving wilderness of the American frontier, every small wound had the potential to turn deadly. Infection was not just a possibility. It was a looming threat, a shadow that followed every cut, every blister, every encounter with the wild. And in a world without antibiotics, sterile hospital beds, or trained physicians a few steps away, frontiersmen had to rely on something else entirely: their own resourcefulness, a few well-chosen items, and a deep understanding of what nature could offer in return. A compact, rugged leather pouch filled with rudimentary medical supplies was often as important as a rifle or a blade. This wasn't luxury. It was survival. Inside might be found a bone, needle, and sinew thread for stitching gashes, a small tin of animal fat or beeswax mixed with pine resin for sealing wounds, and herbs gathered from the woods known to the old trappers and native guides for their healing properties. Yarrow used to stop bleeding. Willow bark, chewed or brewed, to reduce fevers and inflammation. Plantain leaves, mashed and pressed against insect bites or boils, drawing out infection in slow, painful battles against festering wounds. These weren't optional, they were critical. The difference between a man limping out of the mountains or rotting beneath them. But it wasn't just about tending to the flesh. The environment itself worked against the body. Bitter winds and relentless rains left skin cracked and raw. Wet boots soaked through for days led to trench foot long before it was given a name. Men would stop, pull off their footwear, and find their feet blackened and blistered, the first signs of rot setting in. An experienced frontiersman might rub rendered bear grease or lard into his skin, sealing out moisture and guarding against the bite of wind. This act, simple as it seemed, was born of generations of passed-down knowledge. Lessons learned by those who didn't live to pass them on. Then there were the invisible killers. Diseases that crept in slowly. Cholera, dysentery, fevers that seemed to boil a man from the inside out. They struck hardest when clean water was scarce, when camp was made too close to stagnant ponds or animal corpses. The wise frontiersman boiled every drop he drank, using precious firewood even in the pouring rain. He filtered water through cloth, dug wells in dry riverbeds, or drank only after snowmelt, anything to reduce the chances of inviting death with every sip. Even food, when spoiled or tainted, could kill just as surely as a bullet. Meat not properly smoked or dried could rot in a man's pack, releasing toxins that no one could see or smell. Salt, therefore, was a lifeline, preserving what was caught, making it last, ensuring that nourishment didn't become poison. A small sack of salt, carefully rationed, was often guarded as fiercely as ammunition. But sometimes, no matter how prepared a man was, accidents still found him. A misstep on rocky terrain could twist an ankle, snap a bone, a fall from a bluff, a collapsing tree limb, a panicked horse throwing its rider into jagged stone. Injury came fast, often without warning. In such cases, splints had to be fashioned from whatever was nearby. Branches wrapped with belt leather, limbs bound to the body with torn strips of clothing. The man might then be forced to crawl miles, dragging himself toward a river or known trail, each breath a fight, each movement a surge of fire down the spine. Painkillers were crude but sometimes available. A flask of whiskey, if not for drinking, then for numbing a wound or sterilizing a blade. Tobacco, chewed and pressed into a cut to slow bleeding or packed into an aching tooth. These makeshift remedies weren't guaranteed to work. They were desperate acts born from harsher realities. Doing something, anything, to keep moving, to stay alive long enough for a break in the storm or a glimpse of smoke from another camp. And in all of this, perhaps the most essential tool wasn't physical at all. It was the mindset, the mental resilience to endure pain, fear, and isolation, to rip your own shirt into bandages, to press a red-hot knife against your skin to stop the bleeding, to spend hours digging a thorn from your thigh because you knew if it stayed, it would fester. There was no one else to do it, no cavalry, no backup. A man's ability to treat himself, to take care of his own body as both healer and patient, was the only hope he had when the worst struck. Stories abound of mountain men stitching their own wounds by firelight, of trappers lancing abscesses with pocket knives, of scouts crawling on broken legs back to camp after days lost in the bush. These were not superhuman acts, they were simply what had to be done, because not doing them meant death. There was no other outcome. This grim, steadfast commitment to self-repair, to bush medicine, to making do with what was on hand, was not glamorous. It was slow, brutal, and terrifying. But it was what separated those who perished quietly under the trees from those who lived to tell their tales by firelight, years later, with scars as proof that they had known the edge, and pulled back from it. In the harsh and unforgiving landscape of the American frontier, danger was never a distant possibility. It was a constant presence, stalking a man from the shadows of pine forests to the silent banks of ice-fed rivers, and for all the tools that frontiersmen carried to keep themselves alive. Rifles, traps, flint, knives. There was one piece of survival gear that was intangible yet irreplaceable: knowledge. It couldn't be packed into a saddlebag or hung from a belt. Yet without it, even the most heavily armed man was as good as dead. Knowledge was the quiet guardian, the invisible shield. It was the difference between life and death. Not once, but over and over again. The seasoned frontiersman knew the land, not just in general, but intimately. He could read the direction of wind by the movement of leaves. He could tell the time of day by the angle of the sun through the trees, estimate snowfall by the smell of the air, and locate water by studying the flight of birds or the thickness of plant life. These weren't tricks or party skills. They were the product of experience, passed down from father to son, tribe to trader, hunter to greenhorn. And they had to be learned the hard way. No books, no internet, no safety net, only trial, error, and the brutal hand of nature to teach the lessons. Understanding the behavior of animals, for example, was crucial. A deer trail wasn't just a game path. It was a map to where water could be found, where predators might be lurking, and how far you were from other game. A bear's tracks told you how fresh the danger was. The cry of a raven could warn of something dead or dying nearby. The knowledge of animals, their movements, their seasons, their patterns, wasn't folklore. It was science born in the dirt and blood of real survival. A man who understood these things could feed himself. A man who didn't would slowly starve, even with a rifle in his hands. Knowing plants was equally vital. The frontier teemed with vegetation, but most of it could kill as easily as nourish. A berry that looked sweet could rot your insides. A root that smelled earthy might paralyze you in your sleep. The man who had memorized which leaves could be used for poultices, which bark stopped infection, and which herbs calmed pain wasn't just lucky. He was prepared. And when no doctor was coming, when you were 100 miles from civilization with an infected wound or a snakebite swelling up your leg, that knowledge became the most valuable weapon in your entire kit. Weather reading, too, was a life-saving skill. The shifting patterns in cloud formations, the stillness before a storm, the temperature of the wind, all of it had meaning. The sky wasn't just something you looked at, it was something you listened to. A misjudged storm could flood your camp, freeze your fingers, or wipe out a trail you desperately needed to follow. Only a man who understood how to read nature's warnings could find shelter before the worst hit. The others, they were buried under snow, drowned in flash floods, or lost forever to the prairie winds. The danger wasn't always wild, though. Sometimes it came in the form of other men. Knowledge of terrain meant the difference between walking into an ambush and outflanking one. Knowing where to camp, how far from a trail, how visible from a ridge, how sound would carry in the canyon, was a silent act of warfare. It was the intelligence of survival. A careless man might build a fire too close to the path, alerting enemies or attracting predators. A wise one would use reflected firelight on a rock wall, giving warmth and light without drawing unwanted attention. Navigation wasn't just about direction, it was about intuition, memory, and deep environmental awareness. The frontiersmen didn't rely on maps, because maps ran out, landmarks shifted, trails disappeared. Instead, they learned the angles of hills, the sound of flowing water, the scent of specific trees at night, the position of stars as they moved through the seasons. They carved geography into their memory with each step. So even if they were lost on paper, they were never truly without a path. Even within their communities, knowledge played a role in survival. Knowing how to bargain fairly with a native tribe, how to speak enough of the language to signal peace, how to show respect in a way that didn't appear weak. All of this was essential. Many frontiersmen died not because they were ambushed, but because they were ignorant. Ignorant of customs, ignorant of boundaries, ignorant of the fragile, necessary respect that held peace together on the edge of a wild world. The wise man asked questions. He listened. He paid attention to stories, to signs, to history written not in books but in scars. And finally, knowledge brought with it the most important gift of all, adaptability. The land was always changing. Seasons shifted, animals migrated, alliances broke. The man who thought he had it all figured out was usually the one found frozen stiff in spring or with an arrow in his back. But the man who kept learning, who stayed humble before the brutal intelligence of the wild, he was the one who made it through. He adjusted his traps when prey changed. He shifted his route when snow hit early. He abandoned tools when they no longer served him and built new ones from what he had. He survived, not because he was stronger, but because he was smarter. In the end, knowledge wasn't just a tool. It was the tool, is the thread that connected all other tools. It made the knife more effective, the fire warmer, the rifle more reliable. It turned danger into opportunity, wilderness into home, and uncertainty into advantage. Without it, everything else was just dead weight. With it, a man could walk into the unknown with his head high, ready for whatever the frontier threw at him. Out there on the edge of civilization, survival wasn't a matter of luck. It was the result of hard-earned wisdom, relentless preparation, and an unwavering will to endure. The tools frontiersmen carried weren't just gear, they were extensions of their instincts, lifelines in an unforgiving land where failure meant death. From fire steels to rifles, traps to tomahawks, every item served a purpose, honed by the unforgiving lessons of the wild. These men didn't just survive, they adapted, they endured, and they built a legacy out of raw grit and ingenuity. And though that era has passed, the spirit of resilience it forged still lives on. In every challenge we face, every unknown we enter, and every moment we choose to push forward, no matter how wild the terrain.